from Professor Kirstein Rummery, who is an all-round good egg, a member of Engender's board, and an enfant terrible of the social policy world. She's brilliant. She's interested in care. That's the area of her expertise and her research. So without further ado, I will let her take the platform. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you. It's a great honour to come and talk to Engender about these kinds of things. It's a great honour because I know that I'm talking to an informed and critical audience. And I do want to take, as Marcia did at the beginning, just a little bit of my time to talk about Ailsa Mackay, because the project that I'm about to talk about was very much influenced by her. It wouldn't have happened without her input, had she not been incredibly busy with hundreds of other things and also ill. She'd have been part of the project. What Ailsa epitomised to me as a colleague and a friend and a sister and a feminist was the importance of joining the political and the personal. And in particular her case, Emma mentioned I'm the only female professor of social policy in Scotland. Ailsa was the only feminist professor of economics in Scotland. The Academy has lost a very, very important scholar. And Ailsa married the Academy and activism, as all good feminist scholars do. For us, it's not just about ivory towers, it's not just about writing papers for our peers, it's about reaching out beyond the academic community and trying to inspire not just other women, but other people in our fields, other people in wider society. It's also a reminder, and her passing is a reminder, of the underrepresentation and under-recognition of senior women in academia. It says up there that I'm a member of the ESRC Scottish Centre on Constitutional Change, which is led by Professor Michael Keating. This is a network of scholars all over Scotland, funded by the ESRC, to do projects around constitutional change, to inform the independence debate, and also to inform what happens after the referendum, regardless of the outcome. My project, which is what this project has now evolved into, was about gender. It was about care policy. It was about how you can create a more gender-equal society through care policies, what we can learn from other nations as Scotland, and whether we need to be an independent nation to affect those kinds of changes. And the ESRC said, this is a brilliant topic. It's not a fellowship. It's going to take you more than a year to do it. So reapply, and you can have it, and you can have more money, and you can have more time, which is fantastic. This is the only time a funding council has ever said this to me. Normally they say you can have less money, less time, and we want the answers yesterday. So thankful to what is actually a very patriarchal and male-dominated funding council for actually recognising that gender might just be an important element of these kinds of decisions. I'm going to talk a little bit about constitutional change, and I'm going to talk about the impact of devolution and where we've come from and where we might be going. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that I've mentioned, which is the ESRC-funded project called Fairer Caring Nations, which Engender is working on with me. This will run until 2015, and it came out of a series of events that was funded by the Insight Institute that Fiona Mackay and I were involved in, and also Ailsa was very involved in those events. And this was kind of to look at the constitutional future from a gendered perspective. And it came out of the things that Ailsa believed in and did: the marrying of the academy and activism, using scholarship to address real-life issues concerning gender equality, and transforming the debates within our own academic disciplines. Ailsa was very much about trying to transform economics. I'm very much about trying to transform social policy, and Fiona has a really difficult task on hand trying to put transform political science, but we're doing our best. And it's about trying to take gender and feminist perspectives more seriously. It's also about looking abroad and broadening our horizons. The purpose of comparative social policy research is not just to understand the patterns and ideologies, agencies, actors, policies and practices that happen globally, but also to enable us to focus back on our own systems and with an enhanced critical eye. To quote my favourite science fiction author, Robert Hanlon, a stranger in a strange land, to look at Scotland with fresh eyes, having learnt what's going on before elsewhere. So the driving question behind this project is to ask, does independence offer the right conditions for a fairer, more caring Scotland? Nicola Sturgeon argued quite passionately that it does. I'm going to add a little bit of caution into that based on my own academic observations, and also to think about what happens to Scotland as a fairer, more caring society if we stay in the Union. We are facing what I call a perfect storm at the moment. We've got a crisis in the funding and the delivery of long-term care throughout Europe and in the UK particularly. A crisis that's been brewing for some time, but has been really sharply highlighted by the post-2008 welfare reforms. We have cuts in welfare spending, benefits, housing, and in social care that are impacting hugely on disabled people and on carers. We have a coalition government in Westminster that is committed to what it calls welfare reform, which is one of the most misleading titles I have ever heard on a set of social policies. An attack on the poor, the vulnerable, etc. Welfare dismantlement might be slightly more accurate. Reform, to me, suggests something positive and engaging and moving forward. And what we see is a retrenchment, an attack on the basic underpinnings of the welfare state. We have a lot of evidence that this is impacting disproportionately on women, particularly certain groups of women, particularly single parents, older women, and carers. We have, thankfully, I'm grateful to live here, a Scotland that's quite angry about this, quite angry about this set of welfare reforms that feels like it's been imposed on us. It doesn't accord with our values and what we want to actually achieve as a society, I think. We also have the marketisation of care, which has, as I said, it's an ongoing process. This has been going on for 20-odd years, but has struggled to take hold in Scotland in the same way as it has in the rest of the UK, due to a combination of factors. One is a kind of entrenched antagonism within the public sector towards the marketisation of services generally, strong trade unions who have been very cautious about the marketisation of welfare, and at the same time we do have a backward slidingness, I think, in terms of gender-focused and a gender equality focus on policies coming from Westminster generally. The unpicking of a gender-focused policy machinery, certainly under the coalition, a move away from gender equality as being a driving force. You can say what you like about New Labour and be very critical of them, but certainly back in '97 they were talking about themselves as the most feminist party in history, which made a lot of us sort of catch our breath slightly and think, well, you do need to look slightly beyond the UK and slightly beyond your own confines. But and at the same time, we've got a crisis in the Union. We have a referendum and a unique window of opportunity. The timing of the referendum, even the most conspiratorially minded of us, has got nothing to do with welfare reform and gender equality. But it is a window of opportunity in which to raise those issues. raise important issues about gender inequality and about care policy and the intersection between them. Now, I've chosen within this research project to focus particularly on childcare policy and long-term care policy because I can't do everything. And I think these two areas of policy are actually absolutely key to understanding the structural, economic and social inequalities that women face in Scotland and that do need to be tackled by policy if we are going to achieve a fairer, more caring society. So if we look at care policy to start with, the 1999 devolution opened up new possibilities around what we talk about in policy terms as policy divergence. In other words, we've had an opportunity in Scotland for quite some time to do things differently from the rest of the UK. In actual fact, we had some structural opportunities even prior to devolution to do things differently from the rest of the UK, and we have done some things differently. There's always been what's called a kind of different political ethos around care policy within Scotland than within the rest of the UK. And in particular, as I mentioned, that there has been a really ingrained resistance to the neoliberal marketisation of care, I think. At the same time, compared to the rest of the UK, we have a relatively weak user-led movement, which is growing in strength in Scotland, but doesn't have as long a history of political engagement and involvement, particularly in things like direct payments and self-directed support, as places like Hampshire and Manchester in England. We have, as I said, strong trade unions and a tradition of strong state provision of long-term care within Scotland. We have different ideas in Scotland about what constitutes welfare, and we have different actors. We have a closer relationship between the centre and the periphery. We have 32 local authorities, which has, advantages and disadvantages. But the institutional framework within Scotland around care policy is remarkably similar to the rest of the UK and has not changed significantly since devolution. In other words, the governance of care policy is devolved to local authorities. So you have 32 different local authorities, which means you have 32 different criteria, systems of accessing services, rights and entitlements to services, and under self-directed support and care, 32 different systems of self-directed support. So essentially you've ended up, despite having quite a lot of freedom to develop new areas and new ways of doing things, with essentially the same framework as the rest of the UK, particularly in terms of long-term care. And we've taken up policies, particularly marketisation of care policies, under different banners and under different headings. But the level, for example, of the use of marketised solutions in Glasgow, where we are, is exactly the same level as it is in certain boroughs of London, as it is in Manchester, as it is in Birmingham. It's dressed up in different ways, but we have marketised social care in Scotland. Now, I had some problem trying to persuade the ESRC that talking about gender was talking about whether we were a fairer, more caring nation. I hopefully don't have to say that to you, to my fellow feminists and fellow sisters, but there was a lot of, so why do women matter? Why does women's equality matter to a fairer, more caring society? And that was a slight shock to me, because I did have to go back to my feminist roots and Feminism 101 and say why gender equality might make a difference to societies. Those of us lots of people around here will remember I wasn't here for the 1990 devolution, but those of you who were here will remember that it was a very different kind of debate from a feminist perspective. It was explicitly gendered in some areas. And the whole of the devolution governance framework was explicitly set up a gendered policy framework. It looks very different now. Very, very different now. We keep talking about it being male, pale and stale. This week they're arguing about whether Shell's going to move south of the border. A couple of weeks ago, George Osborne was rattling his sabre over whether we or not we would be able to keep pound as a currency, going against all the kind of agreements that we would not have policy agreements in place before the referendum. Why anybody's surprised that the coalition government lied about that is, I don't know, but there you go. There's a lot of boys talking about boys stuff. Even the economic arguments are about what I call boys stuff. It's not about access to work. It's not about fairer or equal distribution of work. It's not about the kind of work that we might want to be doing. In part, I will hold my hand up here as part of the ESRC Centre for Constitutional Change and say this is partly our fault as academics. I personally am not male, pale and stale, hopefully anyway, but most of my colleagues are. Most of my colleagues who are talking about this, who are being interviewed in the papers about this, who are being funded to do research about this, are male. They're male political scientists, they're male economists, and they're male sociologists, and they are concerned with, keep coming back to this boys stuff. But we also have, as I said, a different kind of government in Westminster than we had in 1999. We have a government which no longer takes gender equality seriously and has dismantled much of the feminist policy machinery. So I think that does also reflect the fact that this referendum debate has been ungendered. Where is care? Now, thankfully, Nicola was here this morning and has brought care onto the agenda, and it forms an important platform in the white paper. But it's still not what people are arguing about. As I said, they're arguing about whether Shell's going to move south, whether we're going to have Trident, whether we're going to have the pound. They're not arguing about whether an independent Scotland would mean more effective, more efficient and fairer care policies. But that is what matters to an awful lot of us, and I don't just mean women. I mean an awful lot of Scottish society is worried about this, is worried about long-term care and is worried about childcare. As parents, as carers, as people who are going to grow old ourselves, hopefully, and need care, and some of us already do need care. So this matters a lot to us. This is one of what the boys would call the emotional decisions, but actually I think this is a very rational point, a very rational basis on which to make decisions. This is a very important policy area. Care matters for gender equality. It's one of the, as I said, structural underpinnings to social, economic and political inequality. And I said, considering that, to me, a gender-equal society is a priori a good thing, which I had to persuade the ESRC of, how do we achieve this? How do we get to a more gender-equal society? Well, the evidence would suggest, if we look at research done by my colleagues around gender equality indices across developed welfare states, so that's what we're focusing on. We're not comparing ourselves to emerging welfare states. We're comparing ourselves to wealthy states that can afford welfare states. We can afford a welfare state. And gender equality indices measure things like public participation, women's participation in politics, the participation in work and in other areas of public life, but also access to health and social care and a lot of other things that the Beijing platform recognized as being an issue. Things like representation in the media, etc. That the most gender-equal societies tend to follow the Nordic social democratic route. Strong welfare states with the right to care, particularly childcare and gender equality, embedded within their constitutions. This indicates to me, as an academic, that a written constitution is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary in order to achieve these things. And how on earth do you get a written constitution without having a country that is independent and can write its own constitution? Now, we're going to talk this afternoon about the economy, and I will sort of go over this very, very briefly for that reason. There is a challenge around gender mainstreaming. It's a bit of a two-edged sword. Arguably, it places gender at the heart of everything, but we know if something becomes everyone's responsibility, it becomes nobody's responsibility. So there is a little bit of an issue around unpicking feminist policy machinery and trying to mainstream gender. That's not easy to answer, and I'm not going to attempt to answer it now. The real challenge is to think about the paid and the unpaid economy. This is what Ailsa would tell us, and she's absolutely right. And to challenge mainstream, or as she called it, mailstream, economic thinking, looking at the role of care and treating care as an investment strategy for growth rather than a welfare expenditure. We talked about politics in the panel before. Why is gender absent? Neither side is arguing very convincingly to me that their way would lead to a fairer, more equal, caring society. And particularly the Better Together campaign seems to think this is just not even an issue. I asked Alistair Darling, who was presenting at one of the ESRC conferences, what was in it for women. And he said that women will make the choice based on economic rationality in what's best for their families, i.e. what will bring the best jobs to Scotland. And I didn't have any other time because I thought, I've got 2 hours to argue with you to say, that's not what I'm going to be making my decisions based on, and I don't think it's what most of Scotland's women will be making their decisions based on. Certainly my family and the economy, but not the way that you have just described it in those very narrow, patriarchal male terms. We've got mutual mythologizing on both sides. Scotland's wonderful. Scotland's only wonderful because it's part of the Union. And we've got mutual mudslinging on both sides. It will be a disaster if Scotland is independent. It will be a disaster if Scotland stays in the Union. I'm bored of that. You're all bored of that. We're all bored of Osborne's bully boy tactics over the pound. We're all bored of the economics and market driving the agenda. And we're all very bored as I'm not even Scottish, and I am very bored of a very Anglo-centric media reporting what it seems to me incredibly biased stuff around what's going on. And there is a complete lack of gender mainstreaming throughout the process. There has been no commitment throughout the policy process to gender quotas in any kind of field, in terms of who might draw up a constitution or who might be involved in anything. There has been remarkable silence on that. Nicola has talked a little bit about, the commitments that the SNP will make, but that's not mainstreamed into the process of either the referendum on independence or on what's going to happen afterwards. This is in stark contrast to how other countries have approached this question. Iceland, when it was recently kicking out its bankers and re-establishing its constitution, explicitly put gender and gender equality at the heart of both the process and the outcome of negotiating their constitution. The Catalonian movement for independence is doing exactly the same in Spain. We're not. We'll look at childcare policies and just very briefly go over this because I don't have that much time, and we're also just at the beginning of the process of doing this research, so we'll have more information at the end of it. We can see a move comparatively away from familiarization, which is like placing it in the responsibility of the family, and a recognition that this is actually about gender. It's about mothers and fathers and men and women. It is not just about the family masks gender inequalities. And we've got clusters of regimes. In comparative social policy, you always have to talk about regimes and clusters, otherwise you don't get anywhere. In the first category, we've got places like Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg, where we've got high general family support but low dual earner support. The second cluster is places like Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, where there's very little family support, very little childcare, formal childcare. We fall into the third category, UK and Ireland, comparatively generous child allowances, but very low to middle levels of coverage. We've got the Nordic countries who fall into the fourth category, where there is extensive family coverage. And we have the Netherlands, which is pursued a dual earner, dual carer model, which when you look at long-term care, they have done that as well. And it has led to more egalitarian outcomes for both the users of care services and carers, formal carers and informal carers as well. So we've got different types of policies that we could draw on and learn from. We've got family policies that make incentives for women to stay home, which feels to me, as a feminist, like a step backwards. Particularly in Germany and Finland, cash for care, which undermines previous gender equality commitments. Choice-based policies, which is essentially what we're going to pursue in Scotland, if I understand Nicola's commitment, which is that there will be marketised provision and women will be encouraged to choose marketised provision around childcare. This benefits highly educated, high earners women in particular, so it's creating a huge divide between different groups of women. There is, if you compare Germany, where there is an incentive to stay home, and Sweden, where there is no incentive to stay home, more low earners actually are participating in the public sector and working in Sweden. So we need to remove that cash incentive if we want equality of access to jobs and childcare across the range for all women. Women as consumers face huge challenges, and I can look at you and I can see several parents who have at some point negotiated horribly, probably even to be here, as I have, around a patchwork of provision, a network of relatives, formal provision, state provision, private provision, costing an absolute bloody fortune that all falls apart at a moment's notice. This is what it feels like. Universal access, no surprise that I'm quite in favour of this one, with no incentives to stay home. This does promote equality, but there is a weak relationship between inequality and cost, so that contradicts the idea that it's cost that drives whether women decide to work or not, the cost of childcare. Other factors come into play, particularly around quality and access to childcare, rather than just the cost of it. For example, in Iceland, political and social support for mixed leave policies means that 88% of fathers take up shared leave. In Australia, carer flexibility, where they could take up shared leave, but it's take it or, you don't have to, much, much lower levels of fathers involved in that. And finally, I know it's a bit radical, but if we had a written constitution, we could, as Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Estonia have done, embed a right to childcare in the constitution. And this is substantially very, very effective at reducing inequality. Bear in mind that money spending on childcare has gone down substantially since the 2008 crash. I'll just go very quickly over this because you see similar patterns in long-term care. The marketisation of long-term care, moving away from state provider support to more personalised policies. The evidence shows that policies with a strong commitment to both user control and protection for workers, particularly low-paid personal assistance, offers the best egalitarian outcomes. And policies that have weak protection for workers and users, such as our own, lead to greater inequalities, particularly greater inequalities between groups of carers, differences between carers who are formally employed and those who are employed informally, and different groups of users. So this is what we need to remember. Greater universalism equals greater equality. Better social rights equals greater equality. Gender equality embedded into the Constitution equals greater equality. Investment in care equals greater equality. How do we achieve this? Right. I've got about 2 minutes left. So I will present to you the arguments that the white paper presented. Why we should go for independence. The first thing that the white paper said is, with independence we can make Scotland the fairer and more successful country we know it can be. Independence will provide the opportunity to create a fairer, more equal society built around the needs of citizens. As I've said, the evidence suggests that small, economically strong states with fair welfare regimes and more equal access, equal and fair societies, particularly Norway, Denmark and other Nordic states, have the principles of equality and fairness built into the Constitution and the mechanisms for delivering that equality and fairness, the structures and the policies. And we'll have to talk briefly about childcare, because we need to understand the damage that welfare reform has done, but that, I think, is another debate. Extensive provision of early learning and childcare is a hallmark of some of the most advanced and successful countries today. Independence will substantially bolster the financial case for a transformational change in childcare provision. And the final one is about spending decisions and policy decisions reflecting Scottish priorities and values. For example, the commitment to abolish the bedroom tax, halt the further rollout of universal credit and personal independence payments, and increase benefits and tax credits in line with inflation. I'm going to end on a note of caution. We did all this, and we didn't have independence, and that was quite good, but we didn't go very far. Partly because Scotland is still a very divided society. The gap between the richest and the poorest sections of society are very wide. 15% of Scots are living in relative poverty, and you just need to look at Engender's report to say that, the care gap, the freedom gap, the income gap, the pay gap, the power gap, and the representation gap between men and women is still huge. The white paper creates some of the conditions I would argue are necessary to achieve a fairer nation, but these on their own will not be sufficient. Fairness is more likely to be achieved under independence, but it's not guaranteed. It will depend heavily on a constitutional framework that embeds the principles and actions to guarantee social justice. And at the moment, there are few concrete guarantees that all sections of society, of Scottish society, for example, would be involved in drawing up a constitution should we vote for independence. There is no explicit commitment to the things that we were talking about in the previous panel around gender mainstreaming, gender quotas, and gender equality. So we can look to countries that have got better equality outcomes. We need to accept that care policies are key to achieving those outcomes. Can we achieve those policies as part of the wider UK? At the moment, it's very, very difficult. But we need to bear in mind that that's part of the political terrain at the moment. Would an independent Scotland veer towards the right? Would it become very neoliberal, marketised, and adopt policies that are not about social fairness and justice and equality? It could, very easily. Can we achieve those policies in an independent Scotland? Well, as I've said, I think it's more likely that we would, but not guaranteed. And have my colleagues and friends in feminist circles and in left-wing circles keep begging me, saying, don't leave, please, for God's sakes, do not leave the Union, because we will be left at Westminster with practically no proper left-wing representation, with no feminist representation. You can't abandon us to this. And I'm English anyway, and I'm kind of thinking, that's your problem. You deal with the governance weaknesses in your system and do that. This is about Scotland and what Scotland wants to do, and Scotland's future, our children's futures. It's not about you guys, it's about us. Okay, thank you very much.